Imagine this for a second. You're living in an America where there's absolutely no national force to hunt down dangerous fugitives, no specialized agency to dig into deep-rooted corruption stretching across state lines, and no dedicated team trying to stop spies, terrorists, or organized crime syndicates before they can really dig their claws in. I mean, it sounds like the setup for some alternate history thriller, right? But this was the actual reality of early 20th century America. The country was quite literally defenseless against a brand new, highly mobile breed of interstate crime. So today we're unpacking the true story in this explainer. We're going to see how a tiny, totally overlooked team of investigators evolved into one of the most powerful law enforcement agencies on the planet. So what if the FBI just never existed? To really wrap our heads around the gravity of that question, we have to look at the massive vulnerabilities of the early 1900s. Back then, if a major crime went down, you just had your local police on the case. But to be blunt, these local departments were vastly outmatched. Crime was rapidly organizing, criminals were getting smarter, and they were getting faster. And if a suspect decided to just pack up and flee town, there was zero national backup. None. No federal database, no nationwide manhunt, no federal agents knocking on doors a few states over. It was this massive, glaring blind spot in American justice. Let's set the scene with America before the FBI. It was a new century, and honestly, it brought a whole new level of danger. Picture 1908. America is absolutely booming. Railroads are suddenly connecting the country from coast to coast. You've got the telephone and the telegraph making communication virtually instant. And Henry Ford had just rolled out the Model T, which was a real game changer for transportation. But here's the catch. This rapid industrial progress was a massive double-edged sword. You had these incredible technological leaps on one side and heavily restricted, hyper-localized city police on the other. Local cops usually had very little training, stretched resources, and almost zero authority the very second they stepped outside their own jurisdiction. So think about it. A bank robber, a fraudster, or even an illegal monopoly could use all this modern tech to simply drive past a city limits, leaving the local cops completely powerless in the dust. The getaway vehicles were quite literally outpacing the law itself. Because the chilling reality was really this simple. Justice stopped at the state line. If a criminal made it across that invisible border, they were essentially ghosts. America desperately needed a modern solution to a very modern problem. Which brings us to a president demanding reform and the major push for a national force. Enter President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt believed deep down that the federal government had a duty, an obligation really, to actively protect ordinary Americans from rampant corruption, violence, and the abuse of corporate and political power. He wasn't about to just sit back while criminals exploited the system. So he appoints a guy named Charles Joseph Bonaparte as his attorney general. And yeah, if that name rings a bell, it's because Charles was actually the great-nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. Wild, right? But Napoleon's nephew was facing a total logistical nightmare. Whenever the Department of Justice needed to investigate something, they didn't actually have any detectives of their own. They had to borrow agents from the Secret Service, which fell under a completely different government department. This borrowing system was incredibly expensive, and the DOJ had almost no control over how the investigations were run. Bonaparte knew, for sure, that America needed its own professional, dedicated investigative force. So how do we get from that mess to the Secret 34 and the actual birth of the Bureau? Well, getting a national force wasn't easy. Congress actually pushed back hard. They were terrified of creating some sort of secret police force. In fact, in 1908, they flat out banned the Department of Justice from borrowing Secret Service investigators altogether. They basically stripped the DOJ of its ability to investigate federal crimes. But Bonaparte gets creative. He quietly begins assembling his own dedicated team of investigators. Then, on July 26, 1908, a surprisingly simple, understated memorandum officially authorizes this new investigative force. That was it. No grand ceremony, no ribbon cutting, just a piece of paper. And get this, how many people do you think made up this groundbreaking new national police force? 34. That is it. Just 34 special agents. It's honestly hard to wrap your head around when you consider the sheer size and power of the agency today. But the whole shebang started with just a few dozen guys operating out of a tiny single office building in Washington, D.C. And they weren't even called the FBI yet. The original, very understated name was simply the Bureau of Investigation. At this early stage, absolutely no one anticipated its future global fame. They were just a small group of specialists trying to tackle a growing mountain of federal crimes that the local police couldn't even touch. Now let's look at defending the nation as they transition from fighting fraud to battling espionage. There was absolutely no honeymoon period for these guys. Almost immediately, those 34 agents were tackling massive, dangerous cases right out of the gate. We're talking complex banking crimes, civil rights violations, forced labor, and the absolute horrors of interstate human trafficking. But then, the entire world flips upside down. World War I erupts in Europe. The threat of espionage and sabotage spreads across America like wildfire, and Congress passes the Espionage Act. Almost overnight, the Bureau is forced to pivot. They weren't just solving ordinary interstate crimes anymore. Suddenly, they were on the front lines defending the very survival of the nation against foreign spies and enemy saboteurs. Which leads us to the FBI's lasting legacy and how they essentially pioneered modern law enforcement. Now, we have to acknowledge that those early years were rough around the edges. They were plagued by inconsistent training standards, and political influence definitely affected who got hired. But their relentless, grinding field experience forced them to innovate. The Bureau realized pretty quickly they couldn't be everywhere at once, so they built a network. They started sharing photographs. They distributed fingerprints, which was a completely radical concept at the time, and they sent incredibly detailed descriptions of fugitives to local police departments across the entire country. That simple but brilliant act of sharing information across state lines eventually birthed the famous Most Wanted program. You know, the system recognized worldwide today. That's where it all started. It all circles back to the core philosophy that drove the creation of this agency from day one. It was simple, yet incredibly radical for 1908. Justice should not stop at a state border. It's that exact philosophy that has empowered this agency to battle organized crime, kidnappers, international terrorists, and now modern cybercriminals over the decades. It is just crazy to think how a quiet summer day back in 1908 sparked an evolution from 34 men in a small room to a global investigative powerhouse. It totally reshaped the way we protect society, but it leaves us with a critical, maybe even slightly uncomfortable question for today. As crimes become entirely digital and borderless, how much power does a centralized agency truly need to keep us safe? I really hope this explainer has given you a fresh perspective on the origins of the FBI. There is so much more institutional history out there to uncover, and I'll see you in our future explainers.